October 17th, 1929 to 15. A.M., a black sedan, pulled up to an abandoned warehouse on Staten Island. 3 men dragged a body out of the back seat and dropped it on the cold concrete floor. The body belonged to Salvatore Lucania, a 31-year-old gangster from the Lower East Side who had been climbing too fast, talking to the wrong people, making deals that threatened the old order. They had beaten him for 3 hours, broken his ribs, slashed his face with a knife from his right eye to his chin, stabbed him in the back, left him hanging from a meat hook like a side of beef. When they drove away, they were certain of one thing: Salvatore Lucania was dead. But here's the thing about Salvatore Lucania. He wasn't dead. He would walk 6 miles through the freezing October night with blood pouring down his face. He would show up at a police station, refuse to name his attackers, and disappear into legend. And from that night forward, no one would ever call him Salvatore again. They would call him Lucky. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand what New York looked like in October 1929. Prohibition had turned the city into a war zone. Every neighborhood had a boss. Every boss had an army. And every army was fighting for control of the liquor trade that was making men richer than the robber barons. The old Sicilian bosses, the mustache Petes, ran things the way they had in the old country. Blood feuds, vendettas, Sicilians only. No outsiders. No Jews, no Irish, no one who wasn't born on the island. But a new generation was rising. Young men who had grown up on the streets of New York, who spoke English without an accent, who saw that the future belonged to those who could work with anyone, Italians, Jews, Irish, anyone who could make money. And no one saw that future more clearly than a young gangster named Salvatore Lucania. He had allied himself with Meyer Lansky, a Jewish genius from the Lower East Side who could count money faster than a bank machine. With Bugsy Siegel, a killer so fearless that even hardened mobsters crossed the street when they saw him coming. With Frank Costello, a political fixer who had half of Tammany Hall in his pocket. The old bosses watched this young man building alliances across ethnic lines, and they didn't like what they saw. Salvatore Lucania was becoming too powerful, too ambitious, too modern. Something had to be done. The night started like any other. Lucky, though no one called him that yet, was at a speakeasy on the Lower East Side, nursing a whiskey and talking business with Meyer Lansky. It was a little after 10 o'clock. A man, Lucky knew, walked up to the table. "There's someone who wants to meet with you," the man said. "Important tonight." Lucky looked at Meyer. Meyer shook his head slightly. "Don't go?" But Lucky had spent his whole life taking risks that other men wouldn't take. That's how you got ahead. That's how you became somebody. "Where?" Lucky asked. "A car's waiting outside." Lucky finished his whiskey and stood up. "I'll be back in an hour," he told Meyer. He was wrong. He wouldn't be back for almost 12 hours. And when he came back, he would be a different man. The car was a black Packard with tinted windows. 2 men in the front, 1 in the back. Lucky didn't recognize any of them, but that wasn't unusual. In this business, you met new faces all the time. He got in the back seat. The car started moving. "So where are we going?" Lucky asked. No answer. "Who wants to meet with me?" Silence. That's when Lucky felt the first punch. A fist slammed into the side of his head from the man sitting next to him. Before he could react, another punch. Then hands grabbing him from behind, a cloth over his face, the sweet chemical smell of chloroform, and then darkness. When Lucky woke up, he was in hell. His hands were tied behind his back with wire that cut into his wrists. His ankles were bound. He was lying on a concrete floor in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, and 3 men were standing over him. One of them held a knife. "You've been talking to the wrong people," Lucania, the man with the knife, said. His accent was thick, Sicilian, old country. "You've been making deals you shouldn't be making, planning things you shouldn't be planning." Lucky said nothing. In this moment, words were useless. Only silence had power. "Who do you work for?" the man demanded. "Who's giving you orders?" Lucky stared at him, didn't blink, didn't speak. The first kick caught him in the ribs. Then another. Then another. They beat him methodically, professionally, for what felt like hours. Broke 3 of his ribs, shattered his cheekbone, knocked out 2 teeth. But Lucky didn't make a sound, not a scream, not a whimper, nothing. And that silence, that refusal to beg, seemed to enrage them even more. "You think you're tough," the man with the knife said. Let's see how tough you really are." He grabbed Lucky by the hair, yanked his head back, and drew the blade slowly across his face, from his right eye to his chin. Deep enough to scar, deep enough to mark him forever. The blood poured down Lucky's face like a red curtain. Still, he didn't scream. "Who sent you?" they demanded again. "Who are you working with? Give us names, and this ends." Lucky could barely see through the blood, could barely breathe through his broken ribs. But he looked up at the man with the knife and spoke his first words since the beating began. "Go to hell." That's when they stabbed him in the back. Once, twice, a third time. They strung him up on a meat hook that hung from the ceiling, his arms twisted behind him at an impossible angle. And then they left him there to die. But Lucky Luciano didn't die. Maybe it was the cold air coming through the broken windows that kept him conscious. Maybe it was the rage burning in his chest, hotter than any pain they could inflict. Maybe it was something else, that thing inside him that refused to quit, refused to surrender, refused to give them the satisfaction of killing him. Whatever it was, Lucky Luciano stayed alive. For 3 hours, he hung from that meat hook, his shoulders dislocated, his blood pooling on the floor beneath him, his face a mask of red. Any other man would have died. Any other man would have given up. But Lucky had spent his entire life being underestimated, being dismissed, being told he would never amount to anything. He had grown up in poverty on the Lower East Side, running with street gangs, stealing, fighting, surviving by any means necessary. He had watched his father work himself to death in the sulfur mines of Sicily before they came to America. He had sworn that he would never be poor again, never be powerless again, never let another man decide whether he lived or died. And so, hanging from that meat hook in a freezing warehouse on Staten Island, Lucky Luciano made a decision. He was not going to die. Not tonight. Not like this. Somehow, and no one knows exactly how he worked himself free. Some say the hook was rusty and gave way. Some say he dislocated his own thumb to slip out of the wire. Whatever the truth, Lucky fell to the ground. His body broken, but his will unbroken. He couldn't stand at first. His legs wouldn't work. So he crawled out of the warehouse into the freezing October night, and then, step by agonizing step, he began to walk. 6 miles. That's how far Lucky Luciano walked that night. 6 miles through the dark streets of Staten Island, leaving a trail of blood behind him. His face was slashed open. His back was stabbed. His ribs were broken. He had lost so much blood that doctors would later say he should have been dead 10 times over. But Lucky kept walking, past clothes shops and empty lots, past houses where families slept peacefully, unaware that a man was dying on the street outside, past stray dogs that smelled the blood and followed him like ghosts. Somewhere around 5 a.m., a police officer found him stumbling along a road near Huguenot. Lucky's face was unrecognizable. His clothes were soaked in blood. The officer thought he was looking at a corpse that had somehow learned to walk. "Jesus Christ," the officer said. "Who did this to you?" Lucky looked at him with eyes that had seen hell and walked out of it. And he said 3 words that would become legend. "I don't know." They took him to Richmond Memorial Hospital. The doctors didn't think he would survive the night. He had lost almost half his blood. His wounds were infected. His pulse was barely detectable. But Lucky survived. For 2 weeks, he lay in that hospital bed, healing. The police came every day. Detectives, commissioners, even the mayor's office sent someone. They all asked the same question. "Who did this to you?" And Lucky gave them all the same answer. "I don't know." It was a lie, of course. Lucky knew exactly who had ordered the hit. He knew their names, their addresses, where their children went to school. But he said nothing, because Lucky understood something that the police would never understand, something that the old Sicilian bosses would never understand. Revenge wasn't something you announced. Revenge was something you planned, something you calculated, something you executed with precision years later, when your enemies had forgotten to be afraid. The men who had tried to kill Lucky Luciano had made a fatal mistake. They had shown him who they were, and they had let him live. The story spread through the underworld within hours. The cops were talking about it. The newspapers were talking about it. Every gangster from the Bronx to Brooklyn heard what had happened on Staten Island. They beat him for 3 hours, slashed his face, stabbed him 3 times, hung him from a meat hook, and he walked 6 miles to a police station and didn't say a word. That silence, that inhuman, impossible silence, transformed Salvatore Lucania into something more than a gangster. It transformed him into a legend. Men started calling him Lucky. At first, it was a joke. The luckiest guy in New York. The man who couldn't be killed. But the name stuck because it meant something. It meant that this was a man who had looked death in the face and refused to blink. A man who could be trusted. A man who would never betray you because he hadn't even betrayed himself when they were cutting his face open. Meyer Lansky visited him in the hospital on the third day. He sat beside the bed and looked at his friend's ruined face. "I told you not to go," Meyer said quietly. Lucky smiled. It hurt like hell, but he smiled. "Now I know who my enemies are. That's worth a few scars. What are you going to do?" Lucky turned his head toward the window. The October sunlight caught the fresh stitches on his face. "I'm going to wait," he said. "I'm going to heal. I'm going to build, and when the time is right, I'm going to change everything." Meyer nodded slowly. He had known Lucky for 10 years. He had seen him beaten before, seen him hungry, desperate, outnumbered, but he had never seen him like this. There was something new in Lucky's eyes, something cold and patient and absolutely terrifying. "They made a mistake," Meyer said. "The biggest mistake of their lives," Lucky agreed. "They should have made sure I was dead." 2 years later, Giuseppe Joe, the boss Masseria, was dead. Shot 20 times in a restaurant in Coney Island, while Lucky Luciano was conveniently in the bathroom. 6 months after that, Salvatore Maranzano, the boss of all bosses, who had ordered the Staten Island hit, was stabbed and shot in his own office by men posing as IRS agents. Lucky Luciano had sent them. He had waited. He had planned. And when the moment was right, he had eliminated every man who had tried to eliminate him. But he didn't just take revenge. That would have made him just another gangster. Instead, Lucky did something that no one in the history of organized crime had ever done. He created something new. He called a meeting of all the major crime bosses in America. Italian, Jewish, Irish, anyone who controlled territory, anyone who made money. And he proposed a revolutionary idea. The commission. No more boss of bosses. No more blood feuds. No more fighting over territory like animals. Instead, they would run organized crime like a corporation. With rules. With structure. With a board of directors that would resolve disputes peacefully and ensure that everyone profited. The old ways were dead. The Mustache Petes, who had ordered Lucky's murder, were dead, and in their place stood a new empire built by the man they had tried to destroy. Lucky Luciano ran the American Mafia for the next decade. He survived prosecutions, prison sentences, and a world war. Even when they finally caught him, when Thomas Dewey sent him away for 30 to 50 years, Lucky continued to run operations from behind bars. When they deported him to Italy, he ran the empire from Naples. The man they had hung from a meat hook in 1929 became the most powerful criminal in American history. And those scars on his face, the ones that ran from his eye to his chin, he never hid them. He never got them fixed. He wore them like a medal. Because every time someone looked at Lucky Luciano, they saw what he had survived. They saw what he was capable of enduring. And they understood without a single word being spoken that this was a man who could not be broken. Years later, when Lucky was living in exile in Italy, a young American journalist asked him about that night on Staten Island. "How did you survive?" The journalist asked. "How did you walk 6 miles with those injuries?" Lucky lit a cigarette and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling. "The men who tried to kill me made one mistake," he said. "They gave me a reason to live. Revenge is a powerful thing. It kept my heart beating when it should have stopped. It kept my legs moving when they should have collapsed." He paused and looked at the journalist with those cold, calculating eyes. "There's a lesson there, if you're smart enough to see it. Your enemies can break your body. They can cut your face. They can leave you for dead in a frozen warehouse in the middle of the night. But they can never break your will, not unless you let them." The journalist wrote down every word. "One more question," he said. "Did you ever find out who ordered the hit?" Lucky smiled. The scars twisted his face into something almost demonic. "I found out," he said, "and I took care of it." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The world already knew what had happened to the men who tried to kill Lucky Luciano. They were all dead now, every single one of them. If this story of how Lucky Luciano survived the unsurvivable hit different, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the legendary stories of the man who invented the American Mafia. The chairman of the mob. Drop a like if you understand why they called him Lucky, and in the comments, answer this. Would you have stayed silent? Could you have walked 6 miles with your face cut open? Most men would have broken. Most men would have talked. Lucky Luciano wasn't most men. Turn notifications on because next time we're telling the story of how Lucky walked out of a restaurant bathroom while his own boss was getting shot 20 times. The Staten Island Ride made him a legend. What came next made him an emperor. Don't miss it.